12-year-old Sarah Mitchell sat in the corner of the Springfield Animal Shelter's waiting room, her fingers picking at the fraying edge of her sweater. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with an irritating electric buzz that made her skin crawl. Around her, excited families chatted about adopting kittens and puppies, their voices layering into a cacophony that twisted her stomach into knots. Sarah pulled her knees closer to her chest, trying to make herself smaller, invisible, as if she could fold into the uncomfortable plastic chair and disappear entirely. This was the third such appointment this month. Her mother had promised this would be different, that today might actually lead somewhere. Sarah wasn't so sure. At this point, she'd learned not to get her hopes up about anything. The anxiety disorder that had emerged 3 years ago, shortly after her younger brother was diagnosed with severe autism, had slowly colonized her life like a creeping vine, choking out the normal childhood experiences other kids seemed to take for granted. At first, it had been manageable, just occasional racing heartbeats and sweaty palms during presentations at school. But over time, it had evolved into something more sinister. Now, crowded spaces triggered panic attacks that left her gasping for breath. Social situations became minefields. Even family gatherings felt unbearable. She'd missed her best friend's birthday party last month because the thought of going had sent her into such a severe anxiety spiral that she'd thrown up. Her parents had tried everything: talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, medication adjustments, meditation apps, dietary changes. Her mother had even purchased one of those weighted blankets that cost more than their monthly grocery budget. Nothing worked. Nothing touched the deep, irrational terror that seemed to live in her chest, waiting for any excuse to explode outward. Then 2 weeks ago, during one of her sessions with her therapist had suggested something radical. What about a service dog, Sarah? There's growing research showing that properly trained service animals can help individuals with anxiety disorders. They can sense panic attacks before they happen, provide grounding techniques during episodes, create personal space in crowded environments. Some people find them life-changing. Sarah's first instinct had been skepticism. A dog. How was a dog supposed to fix what months of therapy couldn't touch? But something about the idea lingered in her mind. Unlike people, dogs didn't judge. They didn't expect you to be normal. And maybe, just maybe, having something that needed her as much as she needed it might change something fundamental. Her mother, desperate to see her daughter smile again, had immediately started researching. She discovered that most professional service dog organizations had waiting lists 2 to 3 years long and costs upward of $30,000, a figure so astronomical it might as well have been in a different universe given their modest middle-class income. But then, she'd found the Springfield Animal Shelter's experimental program, a partnership with a local nonprofit that worked with rescue dogs, attempting to train them as service animals for families who couldn't afford traditional programs. The shelter's director, Mr. Robert Hayes, had been skeptical but willing to try. He'd explained that most shelter dogs simply didn't have the right temperament for service work. You needed dogs with specific traits: intelligence, empathy, patience, focus. Dogs that, even from puppyhood, seemed to understand that their job was to help rather than dominate. "We'll see if we can find a match," he'd told Sarah's mother during their initial phone conversation. Sarah had overheard through the closed bedroom door as her mother spoke animatedly, hope creeping back into her voice for the first time in months. Now sitting in the waiting room, Sarah watched other families interact with dogs that the staff brought out. A golden retriever mix that was gentle and calm, a Labrador that seemed designed specifically for children. They were all lovely, all potentially wonderful companions, but Sarah felt nothing watching them. No spark, no recognition, no sense that any of these animals was the one. She found herself internally withdrawing further, the familiar voice in her head whispering that this was pointless, that she was broken in a way no dog could fix. At 2:47 p.m., Mr. Hayes appeared from the hallway leading to the back kennels. He was a thin man in his 60s with kind eyes and perpetually rolled-up sleeves, the kind of person who clearly spent his days genuinely caring for animals rather than managing an office. He caught Sarah's mother's eye but didn't move toward them immediately. Instead, he seemed hesitant, almost worried. "We have one more dog I'd like you to meet," he said, addressing Sarah's mother but glancing at Sarah. He's unconventional. He hasn't been in the shelter very long and he's quite different from the others you've seen today." Sarah's mother exchanged a glance with her daughter. "What do you mean, different?" "He's a golden retriever about a year old, but—" Mr. Hayes paused, choosing his words carefully. "Most families have passed on him because he's quite energetic. Hyperactive, really. We labeled him as not suitable for adoption, but something about him made me think of your situation." Before they could respond, they heard it. A sound like a small earthquake was approaching from the hallway. Sarah looked up just as Scout came barreling around the corner, his golden fur bristling, his entire body vibrating with barely contained energy. He was large for his age, powerful, clearly a handful. The shelter staff member walking him seemed to be struggling to keep him under control. "Sorry," the staff member said breathlessly. "He got excited and—" But then something extraordinary happened. Scout locked eyes with Sarah. In that moment, everything changed. The hyperactive, chaotic dog seemed to see something in this small, curled-up girl that perhaps he'd never seen before. His entire demeanor transformed as if someone had flipped a switch. His racing energy didn't disappear, but it crystallized into focus. His attention became absolute. He walked towards Sarah, not pulling on the leash, but moving with deliberate, gentle steps, and sat directly in front of her. Scout's golden eyes, warm and intelligent, stared directly into Sarah's. It was as if he could see every anxiety, every fear, every dark thought she'd harbored for 3 years, and instead of rejecting her, he simply understood. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, without fully understanding why she was crying. Scout rested his head on her knee. The entire waiting room had gone quiet. Even the other families had stopped what they were doing to watch this impossible scene. A dog renowned for his uncontrollable hyperactivity, now perfectly calm, perfectly present, perfectly connected with a girl who moments before had seemed utterly unreachable. "I've never seen him do that before," Mr. Hayes whispered, genuine shock coloring his voice. "He's never been still with anyone." Sarah's mother had also gone silent, her hand covering her mouth as she watched her daughter's face transform. The tension that had lived there for 3 years seemed to ease, if only fractionally. Sarah's trembling hand reached out slowly and placed itself on Scout's head. His fur was warm and soft. He didn't move. He simply remained perfectly present, perfectly still, waiting. "I want him," Sarah said quietly. Her voice was small, but it carried absolute certainty. "I want Scout." "Are you sure?" her mother asked, though the question felt rhetorical. She could see the shift in her daughter's eyes, something that had been locked away for years suddenly finding a key. "I'm sure," Sarah confirmed, her fingers gently stroking Scout's ears. The dog leaned slightly into her hand, as if affirming the connection between them. Mr. Hayes exchanged a meaningful look with Sarah's mother. "I think we've found our match," he said softly. 2 hours later, as they drove home in their family's aging with Scout resting his head on Sarah's shoulder in the backseat, Sarah experienced something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the fragile, desperate hope that came from therapy sessions and medication adjustments, but something deeper. A genuine sense that maybe, just maybe, her life was about to change. Scout's presence beside her felt like a promise. The dog that nobody wanted had found the girl who needed him most. And neither of them had any idea that their meeting in that animal shelter waiting room would eventually echo across the nation, inspiring thousands and rewriting the rules of what was possible. Neither knew that in the next 18 months, they would discover a language deeper than words, a connection so profound that it would ultimately shock the entire world. But sitting in that car, driving through the Missouri countryside with Scout pressed against her side, Sarah felt it in her bones. Everything was about to change. Her rescue dog had just rescued her. The first week with Scout was chaotic. The energy that Mr. Hayes had warned about was even more intense than Sarah had imagined. Scout bounded through their modest two-story home like a furry tornado, his tail knocking over lamps, his paws skidding across hardwood floors as he raced from room to room with seemingly unlimited enthusiasm. Sarah's mother watched in exasperation as Scout crashed into the coffee table for the third time, sending a stack of magazines flying. "Are you sure about this?" her mother asked, not unkindly, as Sarah helped Scout navigate the hallway without destroying anything else. But Sarah saw past the chaos. She recognized that Scout's hyperactivity wasn't malice or untrained aggression. It was simply the physical manifestation of a dog who had been caged in a shelter, yearning for outlet and purpose. Beneath the frenzy, she sensed something else: intelligence, eagerness, the desperate desire to please if only he could understand what was expected of him. That Saturday morning, Sarah made a decision. She would teach him. Not hire a professional trainer, they couldn't afford that anyway, but actually dedicate herself to understanding how service dogs worked and translating that knowledge into training Scout herself. She spent her weekend allowance on 3 books from the local library: The Art of Service Dog Training, Understanding Canine Behavior and Bonding, and Anxiety Alert Training for Companion Animals. She stayed up until midnight, reading under her bedside lamp, taking notes in a spiral notebook that would eventually become her training Bible. YouTube became her university. She watched videos from certified trainers, studied their techniques, paused and rewound sequences until she understood the reasoning behind each command. By Monday afternoon, Sarah had formulated a plan. Every evening after school and homework, Sarah would spend 2 hours training Scout in their small backyard. No professional equipment, no fancy treats, just her, Scout, and an unwavering commitment to figure this out together. The first week was about establishing basic commands: sit, down, stay. Sarah learned to use her voice as an instrument: lower tones for serious commands, excited higher pitches for positive reinforcement. She discovered that Scout responded not to harsh corrections but to the subtle shift in her energy. When she was frustrated or uncertain, Scout sensed it and became confused. When she was calm and confident, he mirrored that composure. By the second week, they began working on proximity. Service dogs needed to understand personal space, learn to position themselves strategically near their handler. Sarah taught Scout to stay within an arm's length during walks, to never wander without permission. She practiced crowd navigation in empty parking lots, gradually introducing distractions: rolled up trash bags that simulated other people, recordings of crowd noise playing from her mother's portable speaker. But it was the third week when everything transformed. Sarah had been having a particularly difficult day at school. A surprise algebra test that she hadn't studied for, followed by an uncomfortable encounter with some classmates who had made insensitive jokes about. By the time she arrived home, her anxiety was building. That familiar tightness in her chest, the sensation that her heart was beating too fast, the hot shame that seemed to radiate from deep within her body. She told her mother she needed to train Scout. Her mother, recognizing the signs of an anxiety spiral, didn't argue. The autumn evening was cool, the sun painting the sky in shades of orange and purple as Sarah headed into the backyard. She'd planned to work on the blocking maneuver, a technique where Scout would learn to position himself between Sarah and an approaching person, creating physical space during her moments of distress. This was advanced work, something she'd been studying for days but hadn't yet attempted. She started with basic positioning exercises, trying to guide Scout into the correct posture. But her anxiety made her clumsy, her instructions unclear. Scout, sensing her distress, became agitated himself, his movements frantic, his focus splintering. Sarah sat down on the concrete step leading into the house, her breathing becoming shallow. It was happening, a panic attack was building. She could feel it assembling in her chest like a storm front. Her hands started to shake, her vision narrowed. The familiar catastrophic thoughts began their insidious whisper. "You're dying. This will never get better. You can't even train a dog. You're failing at everything." She closed her eyes and tried to breathe, tried to remember the techniques doctor had taught her. But tonight, they weren't working. The panic had too much momentum. Then something extraordinary occurred. Scout approached her with a focus and intensity she'd never seen before. He didn't jump on her or demand play. His hyperactive nature completely vanished. Instead, he placed his front paws directly on her lap and pressed his weight firmly against her chest. It wasn't aggressive or rough. It was precisely calibrated pressure, almost therapeutic in its intensity. Sarah gasped, her eyes snapping open. The pressure from Scout's weight forced her breathing to adjust. She had to take deeper breaths to accommodate his presence. Almost immediately, her racing heart began to slow. The overwhelming sense of doom that had been crushing her moments before started to recede, like a tide pulling back from shore. Scout held the position, maintaining that exact pressure, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that suggested complete focus. He didn't move until he sensed the shift in her, the moment when her breathing normalized, when her pupils dilated back to their natural size, when the terror began to release its grip. Only then did Scout step back, settle onto the ground beside her, and rest his head on her knee. Sarah sat on that cold step in the gathering darkness, her hands trembling but no longer in panic. She was crying, but these were different tears, tears of astonishment, of recognition, of gratitude so profound it threatened to overwhelm her. Scout had just saved her. Not because she'd trained him to do that. Not because she'd taught him to recognize panic attacks through any formal instruction. Somehow, through some mysterious intelligence that lived in his canine intuition, Scout had understood that she was drowning in anxiety. And without hesitation, without doubt, without waiting for a command, he had done exactly what she needed. That night, Sarah wrote feverishly in her training notebook. She described Scout's positioning, the precise pressure he'd applied, the way he'd maintained focus until her breathing stabilized. She wasn't sure if she could replicate this, wasn't sure if it was replicable at all. But she sensed that she'd witnessed something significant, a genuine moment of animal empathy that transcended traditional training. Over the following weeks, Sarah experimented carefully. She learned to recognize the early signs of her own panic attacks, the rapid heartbeat, the tightness in her chest, the shallow breathing. She noticed that Scout began reacting to these physiological changes before she fully acknowledged them herself. He would suddenly become alert, his body language shifting from relaxed to attentive. By gently conditioning him with treats and positive reinforcement during these moments, Sarah began teaching Scout to recognize her anxiety patterns. When he sensed the telltale signs, he would respond with that same life-saving pressure technique, pressing against her leg, her chest, or her back, depending on the situation. The grounding technique that therapists had only explained to her, Scout now delivered physically, instinctively. Sarah was learning something radical. Scout wasn't just responding to her commands. He was developing genuine emotional attunement. He was learning to read her internal states and respond with precisely calibrated interventions that she hadn't explicitly taught him because she herself didn't fully understand the mechanism of his empathy. Night after night, as the Missouri autumn turned into a frigid winter, Sarah continued her midnight training sessions. Her breath would fog in the cold air as she worked with Scout, both of them growing stronger, more synchronized, more deeply bonded. Other kids her age were at parties, on dates, experiencing normal teenage adventures. Sarah was in her backyard in the freezing darkness, discovering that perhaps her anxiety disorder, the very thing that had isolated her, might also be the catalyst for something extraordinary. By December, Sarah and Scout had developed something unprecedented. Not just a handler and service dog, but a genuine emotional communication system. Scout didn't simply respond to commands, he anticipated her needs. He compensated for her weaknesses. He understood her in ways that felt almost telepathic. That Christmas Eve, as she hugged Scout beside the glowing tree inside their living room, Sarah whispered the truth. "You saved me, Scout. You actually saved me." The dog rested his head against her shoulder, and in that moment both of them understood. Their connection was about to change everything. Their journey was only beginning. The Springfield Regional Service Dog Championship was held on a Saturday morning in late February at the convention center. Sarah had been awake since 4:47 a.m., her stomach churning with a combination of excitement and terror. She lay in bed in the darkness, listening to Scout's steady breathing from his dog bed in the corner of her room, drawing comfort from the knowledge that at least one of them seemed calm. She told herself 100 times that this was just a practice run, that the regional competition didn't matter, that they were here to learn, not to win. But the lie felt transparent even in the privacy of her own mind. She wanted this, desperately. Her mother knocked softly on the bedroom door and entered with 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "Can't sleep either?" she asked, sitting on the edge of Sarah's bed. Sarah shook her head. "What if Scout freezes up? What if I forget the sequences? What if?" "What if you're brilliant?" her mother interrupted gently. "Sarah, you've been training that dog for 3 months. You two have figured out something special together. Whatever happens today, you should be proud." Sarah wanted to believe that. But as they drove toward the convention center an hour later, with Scout's head resting on her lap in the backseat, the doubt remained. There would be professional handlers there, dogs with championship pedigrees. She and Scout were showing up with nothing but determination and a homemade training plan. The convention center's main arena was overwhelming. High ceilings stretched impossibly upward. Fluorescent lights created a sterile brightness. Dozens of handler and dog teams milled around, most of them radiating the kind of professional confidence that came from years of formal training. Sarah felt small, out of place, like someone who had wandered into a place where she didn't belong. They were called for their preliminary round at 10:15 a.m. Sarah clipped Scout's official service vest onto his frame, a vest she'd ordered from an online retailer with her saved allowance, and took a deep breath. "You've got this," her mother whispered, squeezing her shoulder. Sarah and Scout walked into the arena where 3 judges sat behind a long table, clipboards in hand. The judges' expressions were professionally neutral, but Sarah could read the subtle shift in their eyes when they saw her, a 12-year-old girl with a rescue dog, not a professional handler with expensive credentials. She could almost see the internal assessment, probably not competitive. The test began. Sarah had memorized every sequence through hundreds of practice sessions. Navigate a simulated crowded space. Respond to handler anxiety signals. Perform blocking maneuvers. Demonstrate sustained focus for 15 minutes while distractions occurred around them. But as soon as they started, Sarah felt something shift inside herself. The anxiety that had plagued her for years still existed, but Scout's presence beside her created a buffer against it. His calm confidence seemed to radiate into her nervous system. When her hands started to shake during the crowded simulation, Scout pressed slightly against her leg, their secret signal, their private language, and the trembling stopped. The judges began taking notes, lots of notes. By the time they completed the final sequence, Scout perfectly blocking a simulated stranger while Sarah demonstrated controlled breathing. One of the judges had actually leaned forward in her chair, watching intently. The results wouldn't be announced until that evening. Sarah and her mother spent the afternoon in nervous limbo, getting lunch, walking through a nearby park, trying to distract themselves. Scout, meanwhile, seemed completely unbothered by the uncertainty. He napped peacefully in the car, his training vest still on, as if competitions were simply another part of his routine. That evening, as the announcer called competitors to receive their scores, Sarah held her breath. "Third place, Sarah Mitchell in Scout," the announcer called out. Sarah's eyes widened. Third place. Out of 37 competitors, they'd placed third. She hadn't expected to place at all. The rush of emotion was so intense that she felt tears streaming down her face before she'd even moved to accept her ribbon. As they stood before the judges to receive their award, the female judge who had been taking so many notes smiled warmly. "That's the most sophisticated rescue dog we've evaluated in years," she said quietly, making sure only Sarah and her mother could hear. "You two have something special. Don't lose that." The drive home was filled with Sarah's mother playing celebratory music on the radio while Sarah sat in the backseat, holding the blue ribbon, unable to stop smiling. But Sarah wasn't satisfied with third place. If they could place third their first time, what could they accomplish with more practice? Over the next 5 months, Sarah entered Scout in 4 additional regional competitions. She adjusted their training based on judges' feedback. She studied what other competitors were doing right. She pushed Scout harder, refined their techniques, expanded their repertoire of service dog tasks. The second competition, held in Kansas City in April, went better. They placed second. The judges' comments: exceptional bond between handler and dog, remarkable attunement. The third competition in June, second place again. The fourth competition in August, first place in their category, narrowly beating out a team that had been training for 5 years with a professional handler. By September, Sarah and Scout had accumulated enough points through consistent top 3 placements to achieve the impossible: qualification for the National Canine Service Dog Championship. Only the top competitors from each region even had the opportunity to compete at nationals. The fact that a 12-year-old girl and a rescue dog had qualified seemed almost miraculous. The local newspaper picked up the story. "Small-town girl and shelter dog earn trip to nationals." The article featured a photograph of Sarah and Scout together, her hand resting on his head, both of them looking directly into the camera with a connection so visible it practically glowed through the printed page. The story went viral in their small community. Teachers brought it up in class. Neighbors congratulated her at the grocery store. Her mother framed a copy and hung it in their living room. But with the publicity came pressure. Sarah found herself lying awake at night, anxiety creeping back in unexpected ways. What if nationals was different? What if she choked? What if the judges didn't respond to their style the way regional judges had? What if winning regionally was a fluke, and at the national level they'd be exposed as amateurs among true professionals? She voiced these fears to Scout one afternoon in October, sitting in their backyard on a bench while the autumn leaves swirled around them. Scout rested his head on her knee and simply listened, asking nothing, judging nothing. "We're going to Denver," she told him softly. "We're going to show them what we can do, and whatever happens, we did this together. We took a scared girl and a hyperactive rescue dog, and we built something amazing." Scout's tail thumped against the ground, as if affirming her words. That month, Sarah intensified their training with a new level of focus. She studied championship-level competition videos obsessively. She created new training sequences designed specifically for championship-level challenges. She worked on her own mental resilience, practicing meditation and visualization techniques she'd learned from sports psychology videos. By late November, when they received their official invitation to the national championship in Denver, Sarah felt as ready as she could possibly be. Her mother took another day off work, and they sat together at the kitchen table, reading the official letter that confirmed it. Sarah Mitchell and Scout, qualified competitors for the 2024 National Canine Service Dog Championship. Sarah had come a long way from the anxious girl sitting in the animal shelter waiting room just 10 months earlier. She'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was taking action in the face of fear. She'd learned that Scout didn't need fancy training credentials or championship bloodlines to be extraordinary. Most importantly, she'd learned that the bond between a girl and her dog could transcend anything the world tried to put in their path. Now, as she held that official championship invitation, Sarah allowed herself to imagine it. Standing in a professional arena alongside the nation's best handlers, competing at the highest level of her sport, showing judges and audiences alike that love and dedication could outmatch pedigree and privilege. Scout rested his head on her lap as if saying, "I believe in you. Now let's show them what we're made of." The journey to nationals was about to begin. The drive from Missouri to Denver took 18 hours. Sarah's mother had taken an extra week off work specifically for this trip, something they could barely afford. They'd saved for months to make this happen, cutting back on groceries, postponing necessary car repairs, eliminating any non-essential expenses. This championship meant everything to both of them. Scout slept for most of the drive, his head resting against the window as the landscape transformed from rolling Missouri hills into the high plains of Kansas, then finally into the towering Rocky Mountains as they approached Colorado. Sarah stayed awake through most of it, alternating between watching the scenery and scrolling through her phone, researching the other competitors who would be at nationals. What she found terrified her. Handler after handler had professional credentials, multiple national championships, sponsors, Instagram accounts with tens of thousands of followers, dogs with impressive pedigrees, championship lineages, breeding histories that cost more than a house. One competitor's bio mentioned she'd been training service dogs professionally for 23 years. Another was a two-time national champion. And then there was Sarah, a 12-year-old girl with a rescue dog she'd trained in her backyard. "You're overthinking it," her mother said gently when she noticed Sarah's increasingly stressed breathing. "You've earned the right to be there just as much as anyone else." But had they? Sarah wasn't sure anymore. They arrived in Denver at 6:30 p.m. on Thursday evening. The national championship would begin the next morning with preliminary rounds. Sarah's mother had made a reservation at a budget motel on the outskirts of the city, a place called the Rocky Mountain Inn that was clean but modest, the kind of establishment where the ice machine was loud and the walls were thin. As they drove through downtown Denver toward their motel, Sarah caught glimpses of the competition landscape. The fancier hotels downtown were hosting the elite competitors. She caught sight of one five-star hotel where she noticed handlers in designer outfits walking perfectly groomed dogs, each animal moving with the precision of a machine. One dog had what appeared to be professional grooming, her coat gleaming under the streetlights, her posture perfectly trained. Scout, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly agitated. He'd never been to a big city. The traffic noise, the unfamiliar smells, the sheer sensory overload was making him nervous. He whined softly in the backseat, pressing against Sarah, seeking comfort. "It's okay, buddy," Sarah whispered, reaching back to pet him. "We'll be at the motel soon." The Rocky Mountain Inn was underwhelming. The room was small, with 2 double beds, a television that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1990s, and a carpet that had been shampooed so many times it had a permanent dimple pattern. The bathroom was cramped. The view looked out onto the parking lot and a busy highway beyond. Sarah's mother tried to make the best of it, suggesting they get dinner and then get some rest. But Sarah found herself too anxious to eat. She picked at a drive-through hamburger while Scout paced nervously in the motel room, unable to settle. By 9 p.m., her mother had fallen asleep, exhausted from the long drive. Sarah lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the highway traffic and the occasional sound of other motel guests moving around. Scout had finally curled up on his bed in the corner, but even his sleep looked restless. Around midnight, Sarah gave up on sleep. She moved to the small window and peered out at the Denver night. Somewhere out there were hundreds of handlers and dogs, sleeping in nicer hotels, probably more confident, probably not scared out of their minds like she was. The doubt crashed over her in waves. What were they doing here? She and Scout didn't belong in this competition. They were backyard trainers competing against professionals. They were a rescue dog competing against championship bloodlines. They were outmatched, outclassed, and about to be publicly humiliated in front of judges, competitors, and a crowd of spectators who would watch them fail. She thought about calling it off. They could drive home tomorrow morning and save themselves the embarrassment. She could tell the judges that Scout had gotten sick or that there was a family emergency. Nobody would know. Nobody would have to witness the moment when a 12-year-old girl and her rescue dog got eliminated in the preliminary rounds. The panic that had been building for hours suddenly crystallized into something worse: complete hopelessness. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed and cried. Not delicate tears, but deep, body-shaking sobs that she tried to muffle so as not to wake her mother. She cried because she was terrified. She cried because she felt like a fraud. She cried because she'd come so far, and now she was about to face the reality that it wasn't enough. That she and Scout, despite their bond and their training, simply weren't in the same league as the real competitors. Scout, even in his sleep, sensed her distress. The dog lifted his head and immediately rose from his bed, moving to Sarah's side. He placed his chin on her knee and looked up at her with those intelligent, understanding eyes. "I can't do this," Sarah whispered to the dog. "Scout, I can't do this. I'm not good enough. We're not good enough." Scout pressed himself against her leg, using his body to provide comfort and grounding. His steady, calm presence was a silent argument against every negative thought screaming through her mind. They sat like that for nearly an hour, a girl and her rescue dog, huddled together in a cheap motel room in Denver, surrounded by the weight of impossible expectations. Around 1:30 a.m., something shifted in Sarah's mind. A memory surfaced. Sitting in the animal shelter waiting room, curled up in a chair, convinced that nothing could help her. That was only a year ago. And in that time, Scout hadn't just changed her life, he transformed it. She'd gone from a girl too anxious to attend birthday parties to a girl competing at the national level. Maybe they didn't belong in the same category as the professional handlers. Maybe their training methods weren't textbook perfect. Maybe Scout was a rescue dog with no championship bloodline. But they had something those other competitors might not have: genuine connection, true partnership, a bond forged through shared struggle and mutual need. Sarah knelt down and wrapped her arms around Scout, burying her face in his golden fur. "Tomorrow, we're not trying to beat everyone else," she whispered. "Tomorrow, we're just going to show them who we are, together." Scout's tail thumped against the thin motel carpet. As dawn began to creep through the window of the Rocky Mountain Inn, Sarah made a decision. She wouldn't back out. She wouldn't hide. She and Scout had earned their place at nationals, and whatever happened, they would face it together. She cleaned her face, drank some water, and climbed back into bed. Scout settled beside her, and this time they both slept. A peaceful, dreamless sleep that lasted until 7 a.m., when her mother gently woke them for breakfast before the competition began. The convention center was only 20 minutes away. As they drove toward it, Sarah watched Scout's ears perk up, his alertness increasing. The dog seemed to sense that something important was about to happen. "You ready?" Sarah asked, looking back at Scout. Scout tilted his head as if to say, "Are you ready?" Sarah took a deep breath and looked at the massive convention center approaching on the horizon. "Yes," she said, "we're ready." She wasn't sure if that was true, but standing beside Scout, about to walk into the most challenging competition of their lives, Sarah decided that truth didn't matter as much as showing up. That was what courage actually meant, not the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it. Scout pressed his head against her hand, and together, they prepared to face whatever came next. The National Convention Center was approximately 4 times larger than any space Sarah had ever experienced. The main competition arena was a cavernous hall with a ceiling that seemed to stretch into infinity, fluorescent lights creating an almost sterile brightness that eliminated any shadows. The space hummed with the nervous energy of over 200 handler and dog teams, hundreds of spectators, security personnel, and officials moving purposefully throughout the corridors. Sarah's mother had to physically guide her through the registration process because Sarah's eyes were too busy scanning the competition, and the sight made her stomach drop repeatedly. The preliminary rounds were scheduled across 2 days, with multiple heats occurring simultaneously in different sections of the convention center. Nearly 200 teams would compete, and only 12 would advance to the final championship round on Sunday. The odds were approximately 1 in 17. Sarah and Scout were assigned to Heat 7 on Friday morning. As they waited in the holding area, Sarah watched the handlers around them with growing anxiety. One woman was wearing a designer tracksuit with the logo of a professional training facility embroidered on the sleeve. Another man had what appeared to be a personal assistant helping him prepare his dog. Everyone seemed so polished, so professional, so completely comfortable in this high-stakes environment. Scout, meanwhile, was displaying signs of stress. His ears were pinned back. His breathing was shallow. He kept trying to hide behind Sarah, which was completely unlike his normal confident demeanor. The dog was picking up on her anxiety, feeding off it, creating a feedback loop of mutual nervousness. "Scout," Sarah whispered, kneeling beside him and placing her hands on his face, forcing eye contact. "I need you to be calm. Can you do that for me?" The dog's ears lifted slightly. He took a deep breath, and gradually his body language shifted, not to complete confidence but to something manageable. Sarah realized in that moment that her state directly influenced Scout's ability to perform. If she fell apart, so would he. She had to be the anchor. She stood up, straightened her shoulders, and told herself, "I can do hard things." Heat 7 was called at 10:45 a.m. Sarah and Scout walked into the arena, and immediately Sarah felt the weight of attention. Judges, spectators, other handlers, all watching to see what this young girl and her rescue dog could do. The preliminary test was complex. Navigate a simulated crowded public space, respond to handler distress signals, perform a series of task sequences including blocking, grounding techniques, and boundary creation. The test would take approximately 12 minutes. Sarah took Scout through each sequence with a focus that surprised her. The anxiety that had been threatening to overwhelm her that morning was still present, but it had transformed into sharp concentration. She could feel Scout's presence beside her, steadying, reliable, present. At one point during a crowded simulation, Scout gave one of their subtle signals, a slight shift in his body position combined with an ear movement, and Sarah understood that he was sensing her anxiety rising. She responded with her own signal, a barely perceptible tap on her thigh and a controlled breath. To any observer, nothing significant was happening. To Sarah and Scout, they were communicating at a level that transcended verbal instruction. When they completed the test, the judges were making extensive notes. The lead judge, a stern woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested she didn't smile often, looked up from her clipboard with something that might have been interest. Results wouldn't be announced until the end of Heat 7. 12 other teams competed after Sarah and Scout, and Sarah watched them all with a mixture of awe and intimidation. Every single one seemed incredibly skilled. One team executed their sequences with machine-like precision. Another handler seemed to have an almost supernatural connection with her dog. When the Heat 7 results were announced that evening, Sarah's heart nearly stopped. In first place for Heat 7, Sarah Mitchell and Scout. Sarah's knees nearly buckled. First place. Out of 13 teams in their heat, they'd placed first. Her mother, who had been sitting in the spectator section, immediately rushed over and engulfed Sarah in a hug. But there were still 16 more heats to complete across Friday and Saturday. First place in a single heat didn't guarantee advancement to the finals. The judges would review all 200 teams' performances and select only 12 to advance. That night in the motel, Sarah couldn't sleep again. But this time it was a different kind of insomnia. The excited, nervous energy of someone who had performed well and now desperately wanted to know if it would be enough. Scout, exhausted from the stress and concentration of competition, slept peacefully beside her. Saturday's heats were even more intense. Sarah watched teams perform that were legitimately impressive, dogs that moved with the grace of athletes, handlers who seemed to have telepathic communication with their animals. One competitor was a woman in her 40s who had won the championship 3 times previously. Watching her and her black Labrador work together was like watching 2 dancers performing a perfectly choreographed routine. Sarah's own preliminary wasn't until Saturday afternoon. By then, the cumulative stress of watching other incredible teams compete had worn on her confidence again. She found herself in the bathroom of the convention center, breathing slowly, reminding herself why she was here. Scout found her there, somehow sensing her moment of doubt. He pushed his head through the bathroom door, which her mother had left slightly ajar, and simply sat beside her, offering his silent, steadfast support. By Saturday evening, all preliminary heats had been completed. The judges had a challenging task, selecting only 12 teams from 200 for the championship round. The announcement of finalists would occur at 6 p.m., just before the final round would begin on Sunday morning. Sarah stood with her mother and Scout in the convention center's main lobby, watching the large electronic board where names would be posted. Around them, hundreds of other competitors and families were doing the same, their fates hanging in the balance. At precisely 6 p.m., the names began scrolling across the board. Sarah's name appeared at position 8. She had made the finals. Out of 200 teams, Sarah Mitchell and Scout were among the 12 selected to compete in the championship round. The moment felt surreal. Sarah grabbed her mother and Scout simultaneously, her emotions exploding in a mixture of joy, disbelief, and terrified anticipation for what came next. But as the reality settled in, Sarah noticed something that made her breath catch. Scrolling through the list of finalists, she saw the name Dr. Richardson with her dog, a championship German Shepherd. Dr. Richardson was the intimidating lead judge from their heat, the stern woman with the sharp eyes who had taken extensive notes on their performance. And in smaller print beneath the finalist names, it listed the judges for the championship round. Dr. Richardson was listed as the primary judge. Sarah felt a spike of anxiety. The judge who had seemed most skeptical about their performance was going to be evaluating them in the final round. The judge who had probably judged hundreds of dogs and handlers would be watching Sarah and Scout perform their most important test yet. But then, Sarah made a mental shift. Dr. Richardson's skepticism might actually be a good thing. If their performance impressed someone who started from a place of doubt, that impression would be genuine. The judge wouldn't be impressed by pedigree or fancy equipment, only by legitimate skill and connection. That night, as Sarah lay in her motel bed, she thought about what was to come. Tomorrow, they would face Dr. Richardson. Tomorrow, Scout's sophisticated service work, the grounding techniques, the subtle signals, the genuine emotional attunement they'd developed, would be evaluated by someone who had spent 40 years studying dogs and handlers. Tomorrow would determine if their bond was something special, or just the product of an anxious girl's wishful thinking. Scout slept peacefully beside her, unaware of the stakes, but Sarah knew. She understood that tomorrow's final round would reveal everything. As she drifted off to sleep near midnight, Sarah whispered a promise to Scout. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm proud of us. Whatever happens, we showed up. We showed them what we're made of." Sunday morning arrived with crystalline clarity, bright Colorado sunshine pouring through the motel window. Sarah woke early, showered, and dressed in the nice clothes she'd brought specifically for the championship. Scout seemed to sense that something momentous was approaching. He refused his breakfast, pressed close to Sarah's side, and maintained intense focus. As they walked into the convention center for the final round, Sarah caught a glimpse of Dr. Richardson in the judges' area. The woman was speaking with another judge, her expression serious and professional. Sarah took a deep breath, squeezed Scout's shoulder, and stepped into the arena. The final round was about to begin. Everything they'd trained for, everything they'd sacrificed, came down to this moment. And somewhere in that arena, Dr. Richardson was watching, ready to witness whether a 12-year-old girl and a rescue dog truly had something extraordinary, or whether they were about to be revealed as impressive amateurs among true champions. The championship arena was different from the preliminary spaces. It was smaller, more intimate, but paradoxically more intimidating. The audience seating had been filled to capacity, over 500 spectators, including other competitors, families, and passionate service dog enthusiasts who had paid to watch the finals. The judges sat at an elevated platform directly across from the competition floor, giving them an unobstructed view of every movement, every gesture, every nuance of handler and dog interaction. Dr. Richardson sat in the center seat, her position as primary judge unmistakable. She held a thick folder, presumably Sarah's competition file with all the notes from preliminary rounds. Her expression was professionally neutral, but her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. Sarah walked into that arena, and for a moment, the magnitude of what she was about to do threatened to overwhelm her. Around that arena sat the most prestigious judges in the service dog field. Thousands of dollars of professional training equipment was visible on other handlers' dogs. The competition represented years of dedicated, professional work. And then there was Sarah, a 12-year-old girl in a modest outfit, with a golden retriever she'd trained in her backyard. Scout sensed her anxiety immediately. The dog's breathing quickened. His posture became rigid. He was mirroring her doubt, feeding into her fear. Sarah closed her eyes for just a moment and made a choice. She straightened her spine. She controlled her breathing. She placed her hand on Scout's head and whispered, "This is our moment. Let's show them." When she opened her eyes, something had shifted. The anxiety was still there, but it had transformed into focused determination. The championship test was the most complex sequence possible, a 20-minute scenario involving multiple simulated environments and crises. It began with a crowded shopping scenario. Fake spectators were positioned throughout the space, actors hired by the competition to simulate real-world challenges. They would move unpredictably, approach Sarah and Scout, create noise and chaos. As soon as the test began, Sarah felt her anxiety starting to peak. Her breathing became shallow. Her heart rate accelerated. She could feel the physiological markers of a panic attack beginning to assemble. That's when Scout gave the first signal. It was so subtle that most observers would have missed it entirely. A slight shift in Scout's ear position combined with his body pressing firmly against her left leg. To anyone watching, it appeared that Scout was simply staying close, but Sarah understood the hidden language they'd developed. "I feel your anxiety. Breathe. Ground yourself." Sarah responded with her own signal, a barely perceptible tap on her thigh twice, combined with a specific nod of her head. It looked like nothing, a natural movement, but Scout understood. "Thank you. I'm centering myself now." Dr. Richardson's eyes narrowed slightly. She made a note in her folder. The test continued. Sarah and Scout navigated through the crowded simulation. When a simulated stranger approached too closely, triggering one of Sarah's known anxiety responses, Scout gave another signal. An ear position shift combined with a specific body stance that created physical space between Sarah and the approaching threat. Sarah gave her response, a hand movement near her hip so subtle it was barely visible. Scout then performed a trained blocking maneuver, positioning himself between Sarah and the stranger with practiced precision. To the judges, it appeared that Scout was simply performing a learned task, but Dr. Richardson was watching with increasing intensity. She shifted forward in her chair. She began making rapid notes. The test progressed to a simulated public transportation scenario. Sarah and Scout had to board and maintain position on a mock bus, while simulated passengers created a chaotic, crowded environment. This was deliberately designed to be one of the most stressful situations in the test. Sarah's anxiety spiked dangerously as they entered the crowded bus. She felt her chest tightening. Panic was threatening. Without any visible signal that she'd given, Scout performed a grounding technique, pressing firmly against her leg while shifting his body position to create a psychological barrier between Sarah and the crowd. But what made this moment extraordinary was the precision of Scout's intervention. The dog wasn't simply performing a scripted task. He was genuinely reading Sarah's emotional temperature in real time and adjusting his response accordingly. When Sarah's anxiety threatened to reach critical levels, Scout intensified the pressure. When her anxiety began to stabilize, Scout adjusted his position slightly, maintaining support but allowing Sarah more autonomy. Dr. Richardson's pen was moving almost continuously now. The other judges had begun noticing her intense focus and were watching Sarah and Scout more carefully. Halfway through the test, during a simulated medical emergency scenario, something happened that visibly shocked the entire judging panel. Sarah experienced a genuine physiological response. Her anxiety spiked unexpectedly, and her body language shifted. Before Sarah had fully consciously recognized what was happening, Scout gave a signal so sophisticated that it demonstrated something beyond standard service dog training. The dog was predicting her mental state. Scout's ear position, combined with a subtle body shift and even a specific eye movement, indicated that he was sensing her anxiety before she'd fully experienced it herself. The dog was reading her physiological markers, probably changes in her scent chemistry, her breathing pattern, her heart rate, and responding preemptively. Sarah gave her response signal, a combination of breath control and a hand gesture that was almost invisible to untrained observers. And Scout performed an advanced grounding sequence that involved pressing against her body while simultaneously creating a protected space around her in the crowded scenario. The judges literally leaned forward. Dr. Richardson had stopped writing and was staring at Sarah and Scout with an expression of complete fascination. From that moment onward, Dr. Richardson didn't look away once. She watched every gesture, every signal, every interaction between girl and dog with an intensity that suggested she was witnessing something she'd been searching for her entire career. The signals continued throughout the remainder of the test. Some were so subtle that casual observers would have missed them entirely. A specific ear position from Scout combined with a barely perceptible nod from Sarah. A hand movement near Sarah's hip responded to by Scout with a precise body positioning. Sarah's breath pattern change answered by Scout's grounding technique adjustment. Each signal was a conversation happening in a language that only they understood. It wasn't the language of formal training sequences or scripted commands. It was a genuine emotional dialogue, Scout communicating to Sarah that he sensed her needs, and Sarah responding with trust and gratitude. What made this moment so extraordinary was that the signals weren't being executed based on memorized instruction. They were adaptive, responsive, genuinely communicative. Scout wasn't performing tasks he'd been taught. He was genuinely engaging with Sarah's emotional state in real time and adjusting his support accordingly. When the final sequence concluded and Sarah and Scout exited the arena, the judges were conferring intensely. Dr. Richardson was speaking animatedly, pointing back at the area where Sarah and Scout had just performed, her expression a mixture of astonishment and something that looked like tears forming in her eyes. Sarah's mother rushed to embrace her daughter, tears streaming down her face. "You were amazing," she whispered. "Whatever happens, you were absolutely amazing." But Sarah was watching Dr. Richardson. The judge was standing up, speaking urgently with the other judges, her usual stern demeanor completely transformed into something raw and emotional. She was gesturing toward where Scout had performed, clearly explaining something the other judges had apparently missed. Then Dr. Richardson did something unprecedented. She called for an emergency judges' meeting. Right there, in front of all the spectators and remaining competitors, the judges stood and walked into a private consultation room. Sarah felt her mother's hand grip hers tightly. "What does that mean?" her mother whispered. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. But somewhere deep inside, Sarah understood. Dr. Richardson had seen it. The judge who had seemed skeptical, who represented the establishment of professional service dog training, had witnessed something that transcended all conventional training methods. She and Scout hadn't just performed their tasks. They had demonstrated a level of emotional attunement that Dr. Richardson, with 40 years of experience, apparently recognized as something extraordinarily rare. The judges emerged from their meeting 10 minutes later. Dr. Richardson's eyes were noticeably wet. Her stern expression had been replaced by something softer, more human. What happened next would become the moment that changed everything. The judge's private consultation room was small, windowless, and soundproof. The other judges had followed Dr. Richardson inside with visible confusion. They'd seen Sarah and Scout perform well, certainly well enough to potentially place in the top rankings, but they didn't understand why Dr. Richardson, who almost never called emergency meetings, was treating this particular performance as if it required urgent, exceptional discussion. As soon as the door closed behind them, Dr. Richardson turned to face the other three judges: a retired military service dog trainer, a renowned animal behaviorist, and James, the competition's oversight coordinator. "Tell me I'm not crazy," Dr. Richardson said, her voice thick with emotion. "Tell me you all saw what I saw." "You're going to need to slow down," said gently. "That was a solid performance, very solid actually, but—" "Did you notice the signals?" Dr. Richardson interrupted, her eyes wide. "Did any of you notice the communication between that girl and dog?" Leaned forward, interest suddenly sharpening her expression. "I noticed something. The synchronization seemed unusual, very refined, but I assumed it was just well-trained." "It wasn't trained," Dr. Richardson said, her voice rising slightly. "At least not in any conventional sense. What we just witnessed wasn't a handler executing trained commands. We witnessed genuine emotional communication between a child and a service animal." James looked skeptical. "Service dogs are always communicating with their handlers. That's the nature of the bond." "No," Dr. Richardson interrupted firmly. She moved to the small table in the room and pulled out her competition file on Sarah and Scout. "Look at this. Sarah Mitchell, 12 years old, from Springfield, Missouri. She trained Scout herself in her backyard for approximately 18 months. There's no formal training credential, no professional handler experience. Scout was a shelter rescue labeled unadoptable due to hyperactivity." The room went silent. "Are you telling me this girl trained that dog?" asked, genuine astonishment in her voice. "With no formal training background?" "Yes," Dr. Richardson confirmed. "And what's more remarkable, watch this." She pulled out detailed notes she'd been taking during the performance. During the crowded bus scenario, Scout demonstrated what appeared to be predictive anxiety response. The girl's body language shifted, indicating anxiety onset, but Scout responded before the girl had fully consciously recognized her own panic. The dog was reading her physiological state in real time. Leaned back in his chair, processing this information. "You're describing emotional attunement at a level that usually takes years of professional training to develop." "Exactly," Dr. Richardson said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been evaluating service dogs for 40 years. 40 years. I've judged hundreds of handler and dog pairs. I've seen championship teams. I've seen dogs trained by the best trainers in the world. And in all that time, I've rarely encountered attunement like what we just witnessed." Was making rapid notes now. The subtle signals, I thought I saw them, but they seemed so minimal that I assumed they were incidental. Are you suggesting those were intentional communication? Not just intentional, Dr. Richardson said passionately. They were a developed language, a communication system created through genuine connection rather than formal instruction. Watch the sequence here. She stood up and began demonstrating, recreating the movements she'd observed. The girl gives this barely perceptible signal, a tap on her thigh combined with a nod. The dog responds with this specific ear positioning and body press. Then the girl signals back with this hand movement. Each signal is adapted to the girl's actual emotional state in real time. James was still processing. But if this wasn't formal training, how did the dog learn to respond to these signals? That's precisely what makes this extraordinary, Dr. Richardson explained, her academic training kicking in as she began analyzing the phenomenon. This appears to be organic bonding. The girl and dog have developed genuine emotional attunement through extended time together. Scout isn't executing trained sequences. He's reading his handler's emotional temperature and responding adaptively. The signals aren't commands, they're a conversation. Stood up and began packing. This could fundamentally challenge our understanding of service dog training protocols. If a child can achieve this level of attunement without formal training credentials, it suggests that the emotional bond and mutual understanding might be more important than we've previously emphasized in our training methodologies. That's exactly what concerns me, Dr. Richardson said quietly. This represents something that contradicts everything the professional training establishment has been teaching for decades. We've been saying that service dog training requires professional credentials, formal instruction, rigorous protocols. And here's a 12-year-old girl who, through pure intuition and dedication, has created arguably the most sophisticated handler-dog bond I've ever witnessed. Was nodding slowly, understanding the implication. You're suggesting we formally recognize this. I'm suggesting we have an ethical obligation to recognize this, Dr. Richardson corrected. This isn't just a good performance. This is a breakthrough moment in understanding animal-human bonding. If we acknowledge what we've witnessed, we have a responsibility to document it, study it, and potentially incorporate these insights into professional training programs. What are you proposing? James asked cautiously. Dr. Richardson took a breath. The judge's commendation for extraordinary bond and service excellence. I haven't given that award in 12 years because I haven't witnessed a bond worthy of that designation. But this is exactly what that award was created for. A handler and dog pair that demonstrates something transcendent, something that goes beyond technical skill to genuine partnership. That's a significant statement, said thoughtfully. You're essentially saying this rescue dog and untrained handler pair represents the ideal that we've been trying to achieve with professional training for decades. That's precisely what I'm saying, Dr. Richardson confirmed. And I believe we have a responsibility to the field to acknowledge it, not to diminish other competitors. Their performances were excellent, but to recognize that Sarah Mitchell and Scout have achieved something rare and remarkable. Nodded slowly. I agree. I've been evaluating dogs my entire career, and I can count on one hand the number of times I've witnessed genuine emotional communication at that level. I'm in, said immediately. This could influence training protocols across the entire industry. We need to acknowledge it. James was still hesitant. What are the logistics? The commendation is typically given at the end of the competition during the awards ceremony. Do we want to make this public? Do we want to potentially overshadow the champion? The champion is important, Dr. Richardson acknowledged, but so is recognizing genuine breakthrough moments in our field. Yes, we make it public. Yes, we explain why. And yes, we suggest that Sarah Mitchell's training methods be studied by professional training organizations. This is bigger than any single competition. The judges filed out of their private room approximately 30 minutes after entering. By then, they'd made their decision. They'd selected the champion and the placement winners, but they'd also agreed on something unprecedented. They would present the judges' commendation for extraordinary bond and service excellence to Sarah Mitchell and Scout. As they returned to the judges' stand, Dr. Richardson caught a glimpse of Sarah sitting in the spectator area with her mother and Scout. The girl looked nervous, uncertain whether her performance had been sufficient. She had no idea that she and Scout were about to receive an award that hadn't been given in a decade. When the judges took their positions, there was palpable tension in the arena. The other remaining finalists were waiting to hear their placements, but before the normal awards announcements, Dr. Richardson stood up, leaning to the microphone. "Before we announce the championship placements," she began, her voice carrying through the arena with authority, "we have an unprecedented announcement. In my 40 years of judging service dog competitions, I have rarely witnessed a bond between handler and animal that represents the pinnacle of what our field aspires to achieve." The arena went silent. Sarah's mother reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand nervously. "Today I witnessed that bond," Dr. Richardson continued. "Sarah Mitchell and Scout, please come to the judges' stand." Sarah's eyes widened. She looked at her mother in confusion, and her mother nodded encouragingly. Sarah stood up on unsteady legs and walked toward the arena floor, Scout moving seamlessly beside her. "Sarah Mitchell and Scout," Dr. Richardson said, her voice thick with emotion, "we are presenting you with the judge's commendation for extraordinary bond and service excellence. In my 4 decades of judging, I have never witnessed such genuine emotional attunement between a handler and service animal. You have demonstrated that the most sophisticated service dog work comes not from professional credentials or expensive training programs, but from genuine love, dedication, and mutual understanding." Sarah felt her mother's hand on her shoulder. She felt tears streaming down her face before she fully understood what was happening. "This award recognizes something far more important than placement rankings," Dr. Richardson continued. "It recognizes a bond that transcends training protocols. It represents the ideal that we, as professionals, have been striving toward our entire careers. Your work with Scout is going to influence service dog training for years to come." As Dr. Richardson placed the award medallion around Scout's neck and shook Sarah's trembling hand, the arena erupted in applause. But more importantly, Sarah could see the expression on Dr. Richardson's face: genuine respect, authentic emotion, and the clear recognition that something extraordinary had just occurred. This wasn't just an award. It was validation. It was professional recognition that Sarah and Scout had achieved something remarkable, something that transcended the traditional boundaries of their field, and pointed toward a new understanding of what was possible when genuine connection met dedicated purpose. 3 weeks after returning home to Missouri, Sarah's life had transformed in ways she couldn't have imagined. The story of a 12-year-old girl and her rescue dog receiving an unprecedented national award had captured the public imagination. Local news had picked it up first. Springfield girl wins National Service Dog Award, but the story quickly spread through national outlets. By the second week, Sarah had received interview requests from 3 major television networks, 2 podcasts, and approximately 40 different publication outlets. Her mother had to establish email boundaries just to manage the volume of correspondence arriving daily. More significantly, Dr. Richardson had reached out directly. 3 days after the competition concluded, Sarah received a formal letter on official university letterhead. Dr. Richardson was a professor at the University of Colorado studying animal behavior and human-animal bonding. She had a proposal. She wanted to study Sarah's training methods in detail and work with her to document the techniques that had created Scout's sophisticated emotional attunement. "What you've discovered," Dr. Richardson had written, "may revolutionize how we understand service dog training. I'd like your permission to document your methods and incorporate your findings into the professional training curriculum. This could change everything." 2 weeks later, Sarah and her mother sat in Dr. Richardson's office in Boulder, Colorado. The professor was in her 60s with warm eyes and an intensity that had completely softened from her stern competition demeanor. Her office was lined with books about animal behavior, training methodologies, and human-animal bonding research. "I've been thinking about your bond with Scout constantly," Dr. Richardson began, gesturing for them to sit. "I've reviewed competition footage multiple times. I've consulted with colleagues. The consensus is unanimous. What you two have developed is extraordinary." "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, still somewhat overwhelmed by all the attention. "I want to propose something ambitious," Dr. Richardson continued. "I'd like to develop a research project documenting your training methods. We would create detailed case studies, video analysis, and then compile everything into both an academic paper and a practical training guide. The goal would be to introduce your methodologies into professional training programs nationwide." Sarah's mother exchanged a glance with her daughter. "What would that involve?" she asked cautiously. "We'd begin with intensive documentation over the next 6 months," Dr. Richardson explained. "I'd visit your home in Springfield, observe your training sessions with Scout, interview Sarah extensively about her thought process, document the development of each signal and technique. Then, we'd publish our findings in peer-reviewed journals and present them at professional conferences. Eventually, we'd develop a training curriculum based on your methods." "People would actually use Sarah's training methods?" her mother asked, surprised. "That's the goal," Dr. Richardson confirmed. "Currently, most professional service dog training costs between $30,000 and $50,000, money that most families simply don't have. Your methods, Sarah, achieved extraordinary results through intuition, dedication, and genuine emotional connection rather than expensive equipment or credentials. That's revolutionary. If we can document and systematize your approach, we could democratize access to quality service dog training." Over the following months, life became a balancing act between Sarah's school responsibilities and the documentation project. Dr. Richardson visited Springfield twice monthly. She filmed Sarah's training sessions. She interviewed Scout's veterinarian about his health and development. She documented Sarah's decision-making process, her observations of Scout's behavior, her techniques for building their communication system. But something unexpected happened during this process. Sarah discovered her life's calling. Working with Dr. Richardson, Sarah developed a deep understanding of animal behavior, training psychology, and the science behind human-animal bonding. What had started as intuition became knowledge. What had been simple trial and error developed into systematic methodology. By the time she was 13, Sarah was co-authoring an academic paper with Dr. Richardson titled "Organic Development of Handler Dog Communication Systems," a case study in intuitive service dog training. The paper was accepted for publication in the Journal of Applied Animal Behavior, making Sarah the youngest author ever published in that journal. Scout, meanwhile, had become an unexpected celebrity. His Instagram account, managed by Sarah's mother, accumulated 200,000 followers. Videos of Sarah and Scout's training sessions went viral on social media. Scout received sponsorship offers from dog food companies, training equipment manufacturers, and animal welfare organizations. But more importantly, Scout became a symbol. He represented the potential in rescue animals. He proved that a dog labeled unadoptable could achieve extraordinary things when given opportunity and love. The Springfield Animal Shelter began receiving significantly increased adoption inquiries. Families specifically requested dogs like Scout rescue dogs with high energy that other people had written off. Mr. Hayes, the shelter director, implemented a new program, Second Chance Service Dog Training, where families interested in training shelter dogs could learn Sarah's methods through video tutorials and guided sessions. Within the first year, 17 rescue dogs had been successfully trained as service animals using Sarah's methods. Within 2 years, over 100. By the time Sarah turned 15, her training methodology had been adopted by 23 service dog training organizations across the United States. Universities began offering courses teaching her approach. Dr. Richardson had secured grant funding to establish a dedicated research center studying intuitive animal training methodologies. Sarah became a regular speaker at conferences and symposiums. She gave presentations to professional trainers twice her age, explaining not just what she'd done, but why it worked, the underlying principles of emotional attunement, the importance of authentic connection, the power of adaptive rather than scripted responses. One presentation in particular stood out. Speaking at the International Service Dog Association conference in front of 300 professional trainers, Sarah stood at the podium with Scout sitting calmly beside her. "When I started training Scout," she told the crowd, "I didn't have formal credentials. I didn't have expensive equipment. I didn't have years of experience. What I had was a dog who needed me and a girl who needed a dog. I had motivation that went beyond professional achievement or financial compensation. I had genuine love." She paused, looking down at Scout. The professional training industry has been saying that service dog work requires credentials and formal training, but maybe the truth is more nuanced. Maybe the most sophisticated service dog work comes not from following protocols, but from listening to your animal, from being present, from building genuine partnership rather than executing trained commands. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes, but the impact extended far beyond accolades and recognition. Families who couldn't afford the $30,000 to $50,000 professional service dog training suddenly had alternatives. Single parents, families with limited income, individuals with disabilities who wanted to train their own service animals. They all could now access proven training methods developed specifically for intuitive, relationship-based learning. A woman in Atlanta with anxiety disorder trained her rescue dog using Sarah's methods and reported life-changing results. A man in Seattle successfully trained a hyperactive shelter dog to be a service animal for his autistic daughter. A teenage girl in Tennessee used Sarah's techniques to train her rescue dog to alert to her seizures, something professional trainers had said would require years of formal training. Stories like these began arriving at Sarah's email address weekly. People sharing how Sarah and Scout's journey had inspired them, changed them, saved them. But the most profound moment came on Sarah's 16th birthday, 3 years after that first fateful day at the Springfield Animal Shelter. She received a letter from a girl named Emma, age 11, from a small town in West Virginia. Emma had severe anxiety disorder and had been told that professional service dog training was financially impossible for her family. Emma had discovered Sarah's story, learned her training methods, and had been working with a rescue dog named Max for 8 months. "Sarah," Emma wrote, "you saved my life, not just because you created a training method that worked, but because you proved that people like me, people without money or fancy credentials, can accomplish extraordinary things. You showed me that my anxiety doesn't disqualify me from having the support I need. You and Scout gave me hope when I didn't have any." Emma included a photograph of herself with Max, both of them smiling at the camera. The bond was visible, the same authentic connection that Sarah had built with Scout. Sarah cried reading that letter. She printed it and posted it above her desk, a reminder of why this mattered. By age 18, Sarah had published 4 peer-reviewed academic papers on service dog training methodologies. She'd received multiple college scholarship offers, including a full ride to study veterinary animal behavior at university. Major publications had named her one of the most influential young people in animal behavior research. But when people asked her what she was most proud of, Sarah's answer was always the same: Scout, and the fact that what we built together helped other people. 10 years after that first meeting in the animal shelter, Sarah stood in front of the National Service Dog Training Association, accepting the prestigious Innovation in Service Dog Training Award. She was now 22 years old, a published researcher, and the developer of a training methodology that had transformed how thousands of families accessed service dog support. But more importantly, she'd proven something fundamental, that love and dedication could matter more than credentials and pedigree. That genuine connection transcended professional boundaries. That sometimes the greatest breakthroughs came not from following established protocols, but from listening to the heart. Scout, now 11 years old, was semi-retired, but still actively working with Sarah. The dog spent his days providing the same support he'd always given, being present, reading emotional states, offering genuine partnership. As Sarah accepted her award, with Scout resting his head on her foot, she thought about that anxious girl who had sat in an animal shelter waiting room, convinced that nothing could help her. That girl had been rescued, not by professional trainers or expensive programs, but by a hyperactive shelter dog that nobody else wanted. And in rescuing her, Scout had changed everything. For Sarah, for hundreds of other rescue dogs, and for thousands of families who had suddenly discovered that extraordinary service dog partnership was possible. All it required was love, dedication, and the courage to believe in something that the establishment had said was impossible. "Thank you," Sarah said simply, holding up her award as Scout's tail thumped against the stage floor. "Thank you to everyone who believed that rescue dogs and untrained handlers could achieve extraordinary things, because you were right. We can, and we will." The audience rose to their feet once more, not just for Sarah, but for Scout, for Emma and Max, for every rescue dog and every family that had discovered that genuine connection could matter more than credentials. The greatest bond isn't built on pedigree, it's built on love.